Tsutomu Miyazaki was born August 21st, 1962, in Tokyo, Japan. From birth, Miyazaki suffered from a rare genetic defect, which caused his hand joints to become permanently fused together. This defect prevented him from being able to bend his wrists upwards and gave his hands a long and slender appearance. The one thing Miyazaki did have going his way was that he was born into a wealthy and influential Japanese family. His family owned a local newspaper company and was very well respected in the area. His grandfather and great-grandfather also served on the town council. The newspaper business kept Miyazaki's parents busy for most of the day, so Miyazaki ended up being raised primarily by his grandfather. When Miyazaki entered elementary school, he was bullied and outcast due to his hand deformity. As a consequence, he mostly kept to himself. Years later, Miyazaki attended a prestigious high school and became one of their star students. To everyone's surprise, a few years into high school, Miyazaki's grades began to drop dramatically. The reasoning for this was unclear to his teachers and family. It just seemed as though Miyazaki had flipped a mental switch. As a consequence, Miyazaki did not receive admission into a prestigious university that his high school usually recommended, and instead ended up attending a local community college. He had originally aspired to learn English and become a teacher, but after his admission into community college, he instead decided to train as a photography technician. After graduating from college, Miyazaki moved back into his parents' house and shared a room with his older sister. Even though Miyazaki was a member of a highly successful family, he expressed zero interest in taking over his father's work at the printing company. After remaining at home and jobless for weeks, he finally agreed to take a position at his father's company as a printer's assistant. Miyazaki would later admit that what he had really craved at this time in his life was someone who he could confide in and talk to about his issues. He was beginning to have troubling thoughts and struggled with bouts of depression, but he had feared that his work-obsessed parents would have ignored him if he had tried to speak up, so he refrained from talking to them about his personal problems. Miyazaki later confessed that at this point in his life, he had begun to seriously consider suicide. Miyazaki only felt any kind of support from his grandfather, who he was still very close with. In 1988, not long after Miyazaki had turned 26, his grandfather passed away. This severely deepened Miyazaki's depression, and he grew even more isolated. In a bizarre attempt to retain a piece of his grandfather, Miyazaki secretly consumed part of his grandfather's ashes. A few weeks later, one of Miyazaki's sisters caught him watching her while she was taking a shower. When she shouted at him to leave, he briefly attacked her, and then, when Miyazaki's mother learned of the incident and confronted him, he also assaulted her. The police were not involved, but this incident created an even bigger divide between Miyazaki and his family, and he decided to move out into his own apartment. Miyazaki was a huge fan of anime and horror films. He had even amassed a collection of over 5,000 videotapes. Without friends or family to talk to, he would often spend his free time inside his room, watching slasher films and Japanese pornography. Over time, as Miyazaki fell deeper and deeper into depression and boredom, he came to the conclusion that the only way for him to recapture a feeling of control over his life would be through what he called acts of benevolence. Rather than continuing to sit alone at home, Miyazaki started driving around town, where he would randomly select children and fantasize about killing them. On August 22, 1988, a 4-year-old girl named Mary Kano went missing while playing at a friend's house. While driving around town, Miyazaki had spotted Mary and had been able to trick her into getting inside his car. He drove her westward to the outskirts of Tokyo and parked his car under a bridge in a wooded area. Miyazaki sat next to Mary for half an hour. After making up his mind, Miyazaki finally leaned over and strangled Mary to death. He then engaged in necrophilia with her corpse. Afterwards, Miyazaki stripped her body naked and dumped her in the hills near his home. He kept her clothing as souvenirs to take home. Miyazaki allowed Mary's corpse to decompose outside for a time before later returning to remove her hands and feet, which he took home and kept in his closet. He then burned Mary's bones in his furnace, grounded them up into powder, and mailed it to Mary's family in a box, along with several of her teeth, photos of her clothes, and a postcard which read, "Mary, cremated, bones, investigate, prove." 1 month later, Miyazaki again started driving around town, searching for the ideal target. While driving along a rural road, Miyazaki spotted 7-year-old Masami Yoshizawa walking home. He slowly pulled up next to her and politely offered the young girl a ride, which she accepted. While keeping Masami distracted with conversation, he drove her straight to the same location that he had killed 4-year-old Mary Kano. There, Miyazaki started taking photographs of the terrified girl until he finally decided to strangle her to death. Just like he had done with Mary, he sexually abused the corpse and took the child's clothing home. Miyazaki discarded Masami's body within walking distance of where he had hidden Mary's body 1 month earlier. Miyazaki discovered that he thoroughly enjoyed sending letters to the family of his victim, where he would explain the horrific details of their child's death. Miyazaki would even take pleasure in calling the family's home phone. When they picked up, Miyazaki wouldn't speak a single word. Instead, he would just breathe heavily into the phone until they hung up. If they didn't answer his calls, he would start calling them back non-stop for hours on end to torture them. On December 12th, 1988, Miyazaki abducted 4-year-old Erika Namba as she was walking home from a friend's house. Miyazaki lured Erika into his car and then drove to an abandoned parking lot where he forced her to remove her clothes to take pictures. Miyazaki tied Erika's hands and feet behind her back and then strangled her to death. Miyazaki discarded her body in the adjoining parking lot, where it was discovered only 3 days later. 8 days after her death, Erika's family received a postcard from Miyazaki with the message, "Erika, cold, cough, throat, rest, death." At this point, Miyazaki was thoroughly enjoying what he believed was now his purpose in life, murdering young children. He claimed that he felt a powerful alter ego take over his body whenever he set out searching for victims. 6 months later, on June 6, 1989, Miyazaki convinced 5-year-old Ayoto Nomoko to play games with him and take pictures together. Miyazaki led Nomoto into his car, where he strangled her to death, covered her corpse with a bedsheet, and stuffed her body into his trunk. Miyazaki ended up taking Nomoto's corpse back into his apartment, where he spent the next 2 days using it for sexual stimulation. Eventually, when Nomoto's corpse began to decompose, Miyazaki abandoned her torso in a local cemetery and left her decapitated head in the nearby hills. Miyazaki kept her dismembered hands for himself, which he would use as cups to drink blood out of and eventually eat. 2 weeks later, Miyazaki returned to collect Nomoto's body parts. He brought her rotting remains back to his apartment and hid them inside his closet. Just over a month later, Miyazaki spotted 2 little girls playing at a park. They told him that they were sisters, and after a brief conversation, Miyazaki managed to separate the younger sister away from the older one. He had just finished convincing the young girl to play a game with him where she would strip naked so he could take photographs, when suddenly her father appeared. He had come searching for his daughter after hearing about where she had gone from her older sister. After seeing what was happening, the father angrily lunged out and attacked Miyazaki, but he was unable to restrain him. Miyazaki was able to slip out of his grasp and run away on foot. After about an hour or two, Miyazaki decided that it would be safe for him to return to the park since he desperately needed to retrieve his car. Returning to the scene of the crime so quickly proved to be his fatal mistake, as police officers were already there waiting for him when he arrived. They detained Miyazaki and ordered a search of his apartment. When they ordered the search warrant, they still had no idea that they had actually apprehended the notorious child murderer who had been terrorizing the area for the past year. Investigators were shocked when the search revealed that Miyazaki was in possession of dozens of photos which directly linked him to the missing girls. While investigating, they also found all of the severed body parts and the clothing of his victims still sitting in his closet. The overwhelming evidence at his apartment was more than enough to place Miyazaki under arrest. During his arrest, Miyazaki acted completely indifferent to his capture and even retained a calm and collected demeanor throughout his entire police investigation. Miyazaki's story led to the Japanese media accusing anime and horror films of creating a murderer, despite the fact that most Japanese citizens would agree large collections of anime and videos were pretty typical in the rooms of young men at the time. Miyazaki's trial began on March 30th, 1990. During the court proceedings, Miyazaki often defaulted to talking complete nonsense, which included blaming all of his actions on his alter ego he called Ratman. Miyazaki claimed that Ratman had been forcing him to kill, and he often spent time in his trial doodling Ratman on pieces of notebook paper. When questioned, Miyazaki described his murders as a good job and never displayed any kind of remorse for his actions. He admitted to investigators that before killing a human for the first time, he had practiced by strangling his dog and killing 2 cats, one of which he boiled to death. Miyazaki's father refused to pay any of his son's legal defense and stated that doing so would have been an insult to his victim's family.